murdered Probus, Carus followed the lead of just about every other emperor who had come to power with living sons, and elevated his two boys, Marcus Aurelius Carinus and Marcus Aurelius Numerius Numerianus, to the rank of Caesar, putting both in line to inherit the empire from their father. We don't have birth dates for either of Carus's sons, but if we figure they were sired when Carus was in his 20s, as would have been typical, then I think it's safe to say that they were both in their 30s at the time. Though in reading about them, you do get the distinct impression that they were younger than that, with Numerian in particular being depicted as a young man, perhaps even in his early 20s. So as not to belabor the point, I would say that the two new Caesars were neither children nor middle-aged men, and simply leave it at that. With a new Augustus in place and two grown sons ready to take over in case anything happened to him, there may have been hopes floating around that a new dynasty was in the making. A new dynasty that would bring some political stability to the empire. But alas, in less than 2 years, all three men would be dead, and the Romans would have to start all over again. Luckily, they would start all over again with Diocletian, who would bring political stability to the empire, so the demise of Carus and his sons didn't turn out to be the worst of all possible scenarios. Carus was the third Praetorian prefect to step into the purple, following in the footsteps of Macrinus and Philip the Arab. The former had been too bogged down by problems in the east to ever return to Rome, while the latter had made it a point to immediately return to the capital to solidify his position. Carus chose to split the difference, remaining in Sirmium to keep would-be German raiders in check, and to finish preparations for the now twice-aborted invasion of Persia. Carus sent his eldest son Carinus to Rome to represent the interests of the new imperial family. To help ensure that Carinus would be taken seriously, Carus decided to further elevate his oldest son to the rank of full Augustus, and charged Carinus with the task of ruling over the west, while he and Numerian focused on the east. With Carinus consolidating the family power in Rome, Carus and his younger son, Numerian, began a slow march to Syria, where they planned to launch the long-delayed attack on Sassanid Persia. As they passed through Moesia and Thrace, they fought a series of short engagements against hostile Quadi and Sarmatian raiders, engagements that were just significant enough for Carus to plausibly claim the title Germanicus Maximus. Carus and Numerian then passed through Asia Minor into Syria without incident, and in 283, they finally initiated the punitive expedition against the Persians that the Romans, well, at least the Roman High Command, had been seeking since the capture of Valerian now some 20 years past. And they could not have picked a better time. The Persian succession crisis that had arisen following the death of Shapur in the early 270s had been settled, but the heirs of the great king were weak and perpetually undercut by rival nobles, leaving the Sassanid Empire vulnerable to the Roman advance. On top of these internal divisions, Bahram II, one of Shapur's sons and the now reigning king, decided in the early 280s to look to the east rather than the west as the best direction for his empire to expand, and launched an invasion of what is now Afghanistan. With the bulk of his available forces tied down thousands of miles away in the mountains of Central Asia, Bahram had no way to counter Carus's invasion of Mesopotamia, and the Romans were essentially able to do whatever they wanted, inflict whatever damage they wanted, and claim whatever territory they wanted unopposed. Carus re-annexed Mesopotamia, occupied Seleucia and Ctesiphon, and then led his army across the Tigris without once facing significant opposition. Things could not have been going better for Carus, but of course, the gods were always a fickle bunch, and right at the moment of his greatest triumph, the emperor fell over dead in August 283. He was almost 60 years old and had ruled Rome for less than a year. There are, as usual, conflicting stories about his death. No one seems to believe that he was assassinated, though that is a possibility that can never fully be discounted. And instead, the sources say that he either died of a natural cause, like disease or heart attack, or dead by a bolt of lightning. The lightning story, of course, received the most airplay in the Roman world, as a freak accident like that, especially one involving a murderous thunderbolt from the sky, was immediately interpreted as a warning from the gods that Carus had strayed from the righteous path. Or, more specifically, he had strayed too far beyond the Tigris River, the long-established outer bounds of Roman territory. The alleged lightning strike was, in any event, the rationale most often pointed to when attempting to explain Numerian's decision to withdraw from Persia despite facing, well, nothing in the way of Persian resistance. Carus had pressed too far east and had been struck dead by lightning. The message could not have been more clear to the superstitious Romans. I would venture to guess, though, that Numerian's withdrawal was actually premised on the same logic that had led to so many Roman retreats from the eastern deserts. It was not worth the men or the resources that would have been necessary to hold the territory. And there was no telling whether the legions would be even able to hold the territory if and when the Persian armies decided to come down out of the mountains, which they would almost certainly be forced to do if the Romans continued to press their luck on the east side of the Tigris. So, following the death of his father, Numerian ordered the legions back to Syria. The campaign of Carus, while uniformly successful, didn't do much to soothe the still bruised Roman ego, and it wasn't until the victories of Galerius some 2 decades later that the Romans really exercised the humiliation of Valerian's capture from their psyches. Unfortunately for Numerian, the gods were feeling extremely fickle these days, and despite his attempt to appease them by heading back home, he too would be dead after ruling for just over a year. The new emperor was apparently in good health as the legions passed through Emesa on what appeared to be the first leg of a long and leisurely trip back to the west to link up with his brother Carinus, but by the time the army reached Asia Minor in November of 284, something was clearly amiss. The story going around was that Numerian had been stricken by some sort of inflammation of the eyes, and was unable to leave the dark, safe confines of his imperial litter. While the emperor was so stricken, orders were issued through his father-in-law, the Praetorian prefect Lucius Aper, a man who found his personal standing greatly enhanced by the death of one emperor and the sickness of another. So much so that his fellow officers began to grow suspicious. The story then goes that their suspicions were confirmed when the stench emanating from the imperial litter could no longer be covered up. The curtain of the litter was thrown open, and the rotting corpse of Numerian was revealed to everyone. That sneaky snake Aper had been issuing orders in the name of a dead man. Now, this whole story is of course preposterous on a number of different levels, but it's the story that Diocletian pushed once he was in charge of the history books, and so, for better or for worse, it is the story that has been handed down to us. Numerian's age was unknown, but he co-ruled the empire with his brother for just about a year. The story then continues that the general staff of the imperial army did not take too kindly to Aper's deception, and met in a closed council to decide, yes, the fate of that sneaky snake Praetorian prefect, but more importantly, to decide who ought to wear Numerian's now discarded purple robes. This was not a decision to be taken lightly, because there was, after all, a fully established Augustus sitting in Rome right at that very moment. Any decision the officers made other than recognizing the full authority of Carinus would be treason and precipitate civil war. But the still Illyrian-heavy general staff looked at the veteran imperial army at their disposal and figured that now would be a pretty good opportunity to get one of their own back into power. The one of their own they settled on was something of a surprise pick, a career soldier by the name of Diocles. Unlike Claudius or Aurelian or Probus, Diocles had not been a man who had won fame leading the legions to victory in battle, and at the moment of his ascension, he personally controlled only a small number of troops. But what he lacked in grand military reputation, he more than made up for with his skill in the less showy, but equally important game of backroom politics. That company of troops he commanded may have been small, but it just so happened to be the cavalry detachment that acted as the personal bodyguard of the emperor. Diocles may not have been a great general, but he had earned a spot in the emperor's inner circle, and carried with him the luster and authority of that association. Plus, over the course of his nearly 20-year-long career, a career about which we know almost nothing, by the way, Diocles had studiously cultivated relationships with every officer and soldier he came into contact with, and that network of allies was ready to spring into action when their friend, comrade, and benefactor decided to take the opportunity of Numerian's death to make a bid for power. The personal loyalty that Diocles inspired in the men he came into contact with was probably the single biggest factor in explaining his success as emperor, because only a man supremely confident in the continued loyalty of his subordinates could have even considered the kind of power-sharing agreement that the Emperor Diocletian would institute. And only a man who actually did inspire that kind of loyalty would be able to pull it off. As I just mentioned, we know almost nothing about the life and times of Diocles prior to his ascension. We don't even know his full name. He appears to have been born in 244 in Pannonia to lower-class parents, and his later detractors even went so far as to label him the son of a freedman. He would have joined the army sometime after the disaster of Valerian's capture, and thus would have spent the majority of his career as an officer serving under the auspices of his Illyrian countrymen, slowly rising up the ranks as that cabal of officers secured. He almost certainly commanded legions in Moesia, and the Historia Augusta records that he also served in Gaul, but modern scholars dismiss that whole episode as a fabrication that only served to put the future emperor in contact with a soothsayer who would helpfully prophesize that Diocles would attain great power after killing an ass, a prophecy that we will see fulfilled in just a minute. He apparently established a positive relationship with Carus at some point along the way, because when Carus became emperor, he not only named Diocles the captain of his personal bodyguard, but also awarded him with a consulship in 283. There is no telling what, if any, role Diocles played in the 3 imperial deaths that preceded his own rise to power. It could be that he played no part in any of them, played a part in some but not in others, or was in on every death from Probus to Numerian as a part of a long-term project to secure the throne for himself. Since he got to write the history books, though, tradition has it that Diocletian is innocent of all charges. His first act as emperor, in fact, was to declare publicly that he had had nothing to do with the death of Numerian, and that any and all blame lay squarely at the feet of the nefarious Aper. He made this announcement in front of an assembly of troops, with a bound Aper on his knees beside him. And in case you're wondering, yes, indeed, Aper is the Latin word for ass. Diocles then drew his sword and personally executed the prefect, fulfilling the alleged prophecy. Once Aper was dead, Diocles retired to his tent to plan his next move. But first up on the docket was the small matter of creating a more, imperial persona for himself. The simple soldier Diocles thus announced that henceforth he was to be known as the far more regal Gaius Aurelius Valerius Diocletianus, a name change that explains why we know him today as Diocletian. Once this was done,